My name is Margaret, and there are days when silence becomes more than just quiet. It becomes a presence. It sits beside you like a shadow that doesn't move, and even when you try to ignore it, it finds small ways to remind you that you are alone. I have lived long enough to understand that loneliness is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is gentle. Sometimes it is polite. Sometimes it arrives without making a mess, and that is what makes it so dangerous. These days, my life moves slowly. I wake up early because my body still keeps its old habits, even though my calendar has almost nothing written on it anymore. I make a cup of tea and carry it carefully to my chair by the window. From there, I watch the street wake up. I watch the morning lights slip across the pavement. I watch people hurry past with warm jackets, busy minds, and places to be. When I was younger, I thought I would always be surrounded by sound. Children, work, neighbors, friends. I didn't realize how much of that noise was temporary. I didn't realize that life slowly rearranges itself until one day you look around and notice that your world has become small and your home has become quiet enough to hear your own thoughts too clearly. It wasn't that I was unhappy. I had learned to enjoy my routines. There was comfort in familiar things, the sound of the kettle, the scent of clean laundry, the soft ticking of the clock. But comfort and loneliness can live in the same room. They can sit on the same couch. They can share the same cup of tea. Some mornings I would sit for hours without speaking a single word. I would not even notice until the day was already half gone. That is what loneliness does. It makes time feel thick, as if it is moving through honey. And when people did call, the conversations were often rushed. Quick updates, practical questions, friendly but brief. I told myself that was simply life. But there was a day not long ago when the loneliness felt heavier than usual. The weather outside was gray and undecided, the kind of day where the sky looks tired. I had woken up with an ache in my chest that wasn't physical, but emotional, and I couldn't quite explain it. I moved around the house slowly, touching objects without purpose, as if I were searching for something I had misplaced. I made my tea. I sat by the window. I stared out at the world, but the world felt far away. At some point, I realized I hadn't spoken to anyone in days. Not properly, not in the way a person needs sometimes, even if they pretend they don't. I felt embarrassed by that realization, as if needing connection was a weakness I should have grown out of. But I have learned something important about age. You don't stop needing warmth just because your hair turns silver. That afternoon, I heard a sound that broke through the quiet like a small miracle. A knock. At first, I wasn't sure I had imagined it. Sometimes when your home is too quiet, your mind creates sounds. But then I heard it again. Gentle, careful, not impatient, not demanding. Someone was knocking on my door. I rose slowly, my joints complaining softly, and I walked toward the hallway. My heart began to beat faster, not with fear, but with surprise. I couldn't remember the last time someone had knocked on my door before calling. It felt like something from another time, a time when neighbors spoke to each other naturally, a time when the world still felt like a community. I reached the door and paused, listening. Another gentle knock. I opened it slowly, and there stood my neighbor. They were holding a small plate in their hands, something warm, covered lightly, as if they were trying to keep it from cooling down. Their expression was kind, but also slightly nervous, as if they weren't sure how I would receive this unexpected visit. "Hello, Margaret," they said softly. "I hope I'm not bothering you. I hadn't seen you in a while, and I wanted to check on you." Those words hit me in a way I didn't expect. They weren't dramatic, they weren't poetic, but they carried something I had been missing: concern, attention, the simple recognition that I existed. I felt my eyes sting, and I immediately tried to hide it by smiling. "You're not bothering me, not at all. That's very kind." They held out the plate. "I made some soup. It's nothing special, but I thought you might like it. And I wanted to make sure you were okay." For a moment, I couldn't move. The kindness felt too big for how simple it was. A knock, a plate of soup, a neighbor standing in my doorway simply because they noticed my absence. And in that moment, something inside me softened. I stepped back and opened the door wider. "Would you like to come in for a cup of tea?" I asked, my voice gentle and hopeful, as if I were offering something I hadn't offered in a long time. They hesitated for a second, then smiled. "I'd like that," they said. I led them inside, and as they stepped into my quiet home, the air changed. It was subtle, but real. The silence didn't feel as heavy anymore. It felt shared, and shared silence feels different. It feels safe. As I walked toward the kitchen to prepare the tea, I realized something that made my heart ache and heal at the same time. Loneliness isn't always cured by big events or dramatic changes. Sometimes it is cured by a gentle knock on the door. And that gentle knock stayed with me long after the teacups were empty. My neighbor sat at my small table, hands wrapped around the warm mug as if the heat was something they needed too. I noticed the little things, the way they looked around my living room with quiet respect, the way their voice softened when they asked how I had been feeling. There was no pity in their tone, no awkwardness, just a simple human concern that felt almost unfamiliar, like a language I had once spoken fluently and then forgotten. "I'm all right," I said at first, because that's what I had trained myself to say. Older people become experts at that word. All right can mean anything. It can mean I'm fine, and it can mean I'm holding myself together with thin thread. I said it with a polite smile and tried to keep the conversation light, but something about the warmth in the room, the soft steam rising from the tea, and the fact that someone had taken time to knock on my door made it harder to hide behind habits. My neighbor didn't push. They didn't ask too many questions. Instead, they told me a little about their own day, their own worries, their own small struggles. That surprised me. I had expected the visit to be focused on me, to feel like help being offered to the fragile elderly woman next door. But it wasn't like that at all. It felt equal. It felt human. And that equality mattered more than I can explain. When you grow older, people sometimes treat you like you are made of glass. They speak to you softly, carefully, like you might break, or they speak to you quickly, impatiently, as if you are slow not only in body but also in mind. Both kinds of speaking can make you feel smaller. But my neighbor spoke to me the way you speak to someone you respect, and that kind of respect can lift you without even touching you. As we talked, I found myself laughing more than I expected. It was a small laugh at first, the kind that slips out without permission, but then it grew into something real. It felt good to hear the sound of my own laughter again, echoing against the walls that had been quiet for too long. I realized that joy doesn't always disappear when you age. Sometimes it simply waits for company. At one point, my neighbor glanced at the little plate of soup they had brought and said, "I wasn't sure if you'd like it. My cooking isn't perfect." I smiled. "Perfection isn't what we need," I said gently. "Warmth is." And as soon as the words left my mouth, I realized I wasn't just talking about soup. We spoke for nearly an hour, not about anything extraordinary, not about deep secrets or grand plans, just small life things, weather, memories, the way the building creaked at night, the way the hallway lights flickered sometimes. But underneath those simple topics was something much deeper: connection. When they finally stood up to leave, they hesitated in the doorway as if they were worried they had stayed too long. I felt a sudden urge to hold on to the moment, to keep the warmth from leaving with them. "Thank you," I said quietly, "for knocking." My neighbor looked almost embarrassed. "Of course," they said. I didn't want you to feel alone." That sentence landed gently, like a hand resting on my shoulder. After they left, I stood for a moment in the hallway, listening to their footsteps fade away. The door closed, the apartment became quiet again, but this time the quiet felt different. It felt lighter. It felt like a quiet after music, not a quiet before it. I walked back to my chair by the window and sat down slowly, my tea still warm beside me, and I let myself breathe. I realized how much of my loneliness had been built from small assumptions that everyone was too busy, assumptions that my presence didn't matter enough to interrupt someone else's day, assumptions that reaching out would be bothersome, that needing company was something to be ashamed of. I'd been living as though I needed to make myself smaller to be acceptable, but that knock proved something else. It proved that people can care quietly, that kindness does not always announce itself, that sometimes someone notices you even when you've been trying not to take up space. Over the next few days, I found myself looking at the hallway differently. The building didn't feel like separate doors stacked beside each other anymore. It felt like a place where lives touched, even if only lightly. I started leaving my door open just a little longer when I stepped out to collect the mail, as if I were making room for possibility. I began to wave at people more often. I began to smile without rushing past. Then, one morning, I heard another gentle knock. Not urgent, not loud, just familiar. I opened the door and found my neighbor again, holding a small bag this time. "I was going to the market," they said. "I thought I'd pick up a few things for you, too, only if you want, of course." I felt my heart squeeze because the kindness was continuing. It wasn't a one-time gesture. It was care becoming a habit. And in that moment, I understood something that felt both sad and beautiful. Sad because I realized how long I had been living without this kind of simple connection. Beautiful because it meant it was not too late to have it. I invited them in again. We had tea again. We talked again. And each time the loneliness loosened its grip a little more, like a knot slowly untying itself. I began to sleep better. I began to feel more present in my own life. The days didn't feel so long. The silence didn't feel so heavy, not because my problems had disappeared, but because I no longer carried them alone. Sometimes all it takes is one small act of kindness to remind a person that they still belong in the world. One knock, one check-in, one warm plate of soup,
and suddenly a lonely heart remembers how to breathe again.
And the more the loneliness loosened, the more I realized how quietly it had taken hold of me in the first place. Loneliness doesn't always enter with sadness. Sometimes it enters with routine, with days that look the same, with conversations that become shorter, with the belief that everyone else is too busy and that you should not be a burden. It enters politely, like a visitor who never leaves, until one day you cannot remember what your home felt like before it arrived. But that knock changed something in me. It didn't just bring soup, it brought a message. You are still worth checking on. You are still worth time. You are still part of the human world. The following week, my neighbor and I began to settle into a small rhythm, not a big friendship that required constant attention, but a gentle connection that felt natural. Sometimes they would stop by for 10 minutes, sometimes we'd share a cup of tea, sometimes they would simply ask from the hallway if I needed anything. These small moments became like stitches, quietly sewing my days back together. One afternoon, I decided to do something I hadn't done in a long time. I baked something myself. Not because I was asked to, and not because I wanted to impress anyone. I simply wanted to return the warmth that had been given to me. I made a simple cake, the kind my mother used to bake when I was a girl. Soft, plain, comforting. The smell filled my kitchen, and for a moment I felt as if time had folded in on itself. When it was ready, I wrapped a slice carefully and walked to my neighbor's door. My heart beat fast, not because it was difficult, but because it was unfamiliar. I realized I had gotten used to receiving less than I needed. Offering something back felt like stepping into a new version of myself. I knocked gently. When my neighbor opened the door, their face lit up with surprise. "Margaret," they said, smiling, "you didn't have to do that." I held out the cake with both hands. "I wanted to," I said softly. "You've been very kind." They accepted it as if it were precious, and in that moment I realized something important. Kindness is not a one-way road. It is a bridge, and bridges are meant to be walked in both directions. After that, our connection deepened in a way that felt simple. My neighbor would sometimes tell me about their own loneliness, too. The truth is, many people are lonely, even the ones who seem busy, even the ones who look strong. Loneliness hides in crowded places as easily as it hides in quiet homes. And sometimes all it takes is a single person noticing to make it feel less sharp. There was one evening when the power went out in our building. The hallway lights disappeared and the world turned suddenly dim and still. I sat in my living room with a small candle lit on the table, listening to the building's silence. In the past, that kind of quiet would have made me feel uneasy. But that night, I heard footsteps in the hallway and a voice calling softly, "Margaret, are you okay?" I opened the door, and there was my neighbor holding a small flashlight. They smiled when they saw me. "I just wanted to check," they said. "It's dark out here. I didn't want you to be scared." The tenderness in that simple act brought tears to my eyes. Not dramatic tears, just the quiet kind that come when the heart recognizes care. "I'm all right," I said, "but thank you for coming." They stood there for a moment and then asked, "Would you like some company until the lights come back?" And so we sat together in my living room, candlelight flickering gently across the walls. We talked softly, as if we were sharing the darkness rather than fighting it. The power returned eventually, but something else had already returned too, a sense of belonging.
That night, after my neighbor went home, I sat by my window for a long time. The street lights outside cast a gentle glow, and the glass reflected my face back at me. Silver hair, gentle lines, eyes that had lived through many seasons. And in those eyes, I saw something I hadn't seen in a while. Relief. Not because life was suddenly perfect, but because I no longer felt invisible. I realized that loneliness often grows when we begin to believe we are not worth someone else's attention, when we assume that reaching out will inconvenience people, when we convince ourselves to be quiet, to be easy, to be unnoticed. But the truth is, every human heart needs connection, even the ones that pretend they don't. If you are listening to my story right now and you have been living with that kind of quiet loneliness, I want you to hear this clearly. You are not weak for needing warmth. You are not a burden for wanting company. And you are not invisible even if the world has made you feel that way. Sometimes healing begins with something very small. A neighbor noticing your absence. A knock on the door, a simple question, "Are you okay?" And maybe you don't have a neighbor like mine. Maybe your kindness will come from a different direction, but I hope it comes. And I hope when it does, you let it in, because loneliness does not deserve to win. That night, I opened the window slightly and let the cool air enter the room. I held my warm cup of tea and I allowed myself to smile. Not a big smile, a small one, the kind that says quietly, "I'm still here." And for the first time in a long time, the quiet in my home didn't feel like emptiness. It felt like peace.